Hi, this is Brad Linder with Liliputing, and this is a little computer, a little laptop computer called the One Mix 3 Yoga. And as you can see, when I say little, I mean it's small enough to fairly easily and comfortably hold in one hand. It weighs about a pound and a half, and it has an 8.4-inch diagonal display. It's smaller than most typical laptops, which means it's a device that you might be able to take places you wouldn't normally take a laptop. Now, I've reviewed a lot of little laptops in the last couple of years, and this is probably one of my favorites, and there's a few reasons for that. It's a versatile machine that you can use as a tablet as well as a notebook, and it's got a fairly decent keyboard that makes touch typing relatively easy. It's got a decent number of ports. It is not fanless, but it's fairly quiet, and overall, it's got a processor that's pretty much up to most of the tasks that I wanted to throw at it. It's not necessarily going to be a replacement for a high-end laptop or desktop computer, but as a mobile companion, it's a pretty interesting device. Now, this was sent to me by the folks at One Netbook for purposes of this review, and I'll dive into some of those details in a moment here. I just want to point out that it sells for currently about $760 for this particular configuration, which has a 8.4-inch 2560 by 1600 pixel touchscreen display. It has a Intel Core M3 8100Y processor, 8 gigs of RAM, and 256 gigs of NVMe solid-state storage. There are configurations with more memory and storage, and if you open it up, you can upgrade the storage, but not the memory. So it's at $760, it might be a little bit of a tough sell as a secondary device. I think that this is the sort of device that might not be powerful enough to recommend most people use as their primary computer. It's more of a companion device. So in that price range, you can get a full-fledged laptop, but it wouldn't be as small, it wouldn't be as portable as this device. Or you could get something like an iPad Pro, which is a pretty versatile machine in its own right for about $800 and up. But this is similarly priced, and it has the integrated keyboard and a fairly compact design, which makes it pretty nice. So, as I mentioned, it's a multi-mode device that you can use as a tablet. So I want to show you a little bit of that functionality here. Go ahead and close that. If we grab a pen, which is sold as an optional accessory, and say we want to create a document, actually let's create a new one. We could draw pictures here. I can put my hand on the screen. It supports palm rejection. I can write. I can switch the pen tips. I'm just using OneNote here. And you can see there's pressure sensitivity as well. My handwriting isn't great. My drawing ability isn't great. This isn't something I do a lot, but it is something that I know people wanted to know more about. So it does support Microsoft's Pen Protocol, which means that when you buy this, you can spend a little bit extra, maybe about $20 extra, to add a touch-sensitive or pressure-sensitive pen like this one. Or if you have a Surface Pen or something else lying around, it should be interoperable. So that's a quick look at pen support. You could also, of course, just use it in tablet mode with your fingers. And for instance, I can open up a web browser. I can switch to tablet mode for a sort of simpler user interface. From here, I could bring up a keyboard and type in Liliputing. And then I could just use it to read the news or whatnot. Or I could switch back to laptop mode, turn off tablet mode, and use it to get work done. Let's take a quick look at the keyboard. As I mentioned, it's got a surprisingly good keyboard for a device this small. The keys are backlit, as you can see. If you turn off the backlight, they can be a little bit harder to make out from certain angles because of this sort of silver and gray color scheme. But with the backlight on, it's pretty easy to see most of the keys in most lighting environments. The keys are pretty close to full-size keys as far as I can tell, and the travel is pretty nice. The spacing between them is good. It's not quite as wide as a typical keyboard, but it does support 6 rows of keys and 67 overall keys. A few things are doubled up, as you would expect. So some of the punctuation keys, like the apostrophe and the quotation marks and the colon and semicolon are in kind of weird locations here. They're to the right of the space bar. The delete and backspace are above each other over here. The tab is one that always takes me a moment to get used to. It's above the number 2 instead of over here where you'd normally expect it. But overall, there's just a few things to get used to, and the alphanumeric keys are pretty much exactly where you'd expect, and the number keys are full size, which I find helpful. So if I were to do a typing test like this, Lisp has jokingly been called the most intelligent way to misuse a computer. I think that description is a great compliment because it transmits the full flavor of liberation. It has assisted a number of our most gifted fellow humans in thinking previously impossible thoughts. So that was about 74 words per minute, which is about average for me on this particular laptop. It's a little bit slower than on a full screen, and if you noticed, I probably slowed down the most when I was looking for some of those punctuation keys. So when I need to use the colon or the apostrophe, it still takes me a moment to remember I have to go down here, and these are half width keys, which can make them a little bit harder to find as well. But for the most part, typing I find to be pretty pleasant, especially when compared with most of the other little laptops I've tested recently, including earlier versions of One Mix Yoga devices. This model has an 8.4-inch screen, up from 7 inches for the original One Mix Yoga and the One Mix 3 Yoga, and that provides more room for keys down here. Now, there's not room for a full-size touchpad, you'll notice, so you don't have support for multi-touch gestures or anything, but you do have this little optical touch sensor that you can use to do some basic work. So I can navigate here, I can open applications, I can sort of navigate like that. It's not quite as easy to use as a regular touchpad, but again, I can also just reach up and touch the screen if I wanted to, and there are left and right click buttons here below it, so you can get used to it, or you can plug in an external mouse if that's something that is more your speed. Speaking of speed, it has a Core M3 processor, as I mentioned. That's a dual-core chip that's relatively low power, but more than up to the task of most of what I do on a day-to-day basis. I was able to use this as my work machine for writing articles for Liliputing, doing research with a dozen or more browser tabs open at the same time. It works pretty well for watching videos, for basic tasks. If you wanted something for video editing, the small screen and the relatively slow processor might be a little bit less than ideal. And, it'll sort of struggle if you give it too much hard work to do. So let me show you what happens, for instance, if I fire up... Actually, first let me get hardware monitor open. I'm going to fire up Prime 95, which is basically a torture test. So it's going to run over here, and you'll notice for a second, the CPU kicks all the way up to 15 watts. It's going to slow down shortly as sort of that burst speed. And we've got a little bit of flicker here, so I'm just going to angle this a little bit differently. So now it's going down to 6 watts or so. Now, this is not a fanless machine, but it's pretty quiet. You can't really hear much of the fan noise, even under this torture test. It's going to get warmer momentarily, and once it does, the fan's going to kick into higher gear. You can control the fan speed a little bit using a keyboard shortcut, which I'll show you once that happens. But you can see the CPU is running at 100%, maximum speed at about 2.7 gigahertz. 1.7 gigahertz is more common, and the temperatures are around 60 degrees Celsius, or around 140 degrees Fahrenheit right now. As I mentioned, there is that keyboard shortcut. If I hit Function plus Delete, it doesn't turn the fan off, but it sort of keeps it in lower gear, which might affect performance a little bit, but it also keeps the system running a little bit more quietly. All right, so the fan just kicked into a higher. That's what it sounds like when it's working harder. So it's sort of a high-pitched whining noise. And it just sort of whirred down there because I disabled it. And you know we've switched that mode because you'll see a little flashing light here over the screen, or over the power button. So that's what happens when you sort of push it to its extremes. It throttles a little bit, but overall still works pretty decently. But it can get a little bit warm, so that's one thing to keep in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and exit that. And now the CPU is running at a much lower speed, and it's using a lot less power, and the fan should slow down a little bit. So another thing that I should point out is that it has a mono speaker instead of stereo speakers. Like I said, it can get a little bit warm, particularly it's got an aluminum chassis, and it gets kind of warm on the bottom and around the top of it when you're using it. Not necessarily uncomfortably hot, but warm enough that if you were, say, wearing shorts, you might not want to place it on your legs. If you're wearing jeans, it's not a problem. If you're putting it down on a table, it's not as much of a problem. Overall performance, it does not score as high in benchmarks as some other similar devices with similar hardware. So I also tested the GPD P2 Max, and you can find more details at liliputing.com about how these two compare with one another. I will say that the P2 Max scores higher on most benchmarks and gets slightly longer battery life. It also has a slightly larger screen and a slightly larger battery, so that's not surprising. I think some of these are compromises that might have been made in order to include things like the convertible tablet style design, the backlit keyboard, and so on. In terms of performance, it doesn't score quite as well in benchmarks, but I think the keyboard sort of helps make up for it. I really enjoy using this device, and it does well enough that that I'm not necessarily concerned about performance overall. Despite the additional heat that you get from this model, the P2 Max does run a little bit cooler. I will say, though, that this has a mono speaker instead of stereo speakers on the P2 Max. This gets about 20 minutes shorter battery life in a test that I ran for about 4 hours and 50 minutes when running Netflix versus 5 hours and 10 minutes on the other model. So there are definitely some advantages to the P2 Max, but the P2 Max isn't a convertible tablet. It doesn't have a backlit keyboard, and it doesn't support pressure-sensitive pen input. So even though that is a higher performance machine, I've kind of enjoyed using this one a little bit better. I also like the keyboard better. We haven't even looked at this yet. We've got a headset jack, micro or mini HDMI port, USB Type A port, USB Type C port, and a micro SD card reader. That's pretty much it for your ports, but you can use this Type C for both power and data. So it comes with this 30-watt USB PD power adapter and this cable, this charging cable that's, I don't know, maybe 3 feet long or so. So if you need a longer cable, because it is pretty much just using a standard USB power delivery, you should be able to find a longer cable and plug that in if you wanted to. You can also charge it from a USB power bank if you really wanted to. I've used it with several different ones and has been able to charge. And then again, this is a 30-watt power charger, but you can actually use it with slightly lower power ones. It'll just charge more slowly. So the overall experience of using this device, I think, is pretty good, and I've really enjoyed my time using it. I like that it's a versatile multi-mode device. I like that it's reasonably responsive. I should point out that in tablet mode, the power button and the fingerprint sensor work, but the rest of the keys are turned off, so it does not detect my typing. This is sort of what it looks like when you're holding it from the back. And it's an interesting sort of companion device or secondary device that you might want to take places that you wouldn't normally take a laptop computer. It's kind of large to fold up and just slide into a pocket. You can maybe fit into a pants pocket if your pants are large enough or your pockets are large enough, but it's a little bit larger than the 7-inch models that OneMix and GPD had released in the past, and so that makes it maybe not the perfect travel companion for everybody. And, you know, when you're looking at something that's going to cost $700-800 or more, then you do sort of have to wonder why not spend that money on a full-size laptop, especially when you can find full-size laptops that maybe weigh 2.5 pounds instead of 1.5 pounds. But you do make some compromises for this smaller size, such as the lack of a full-size touchpad, the lack of stereo speakers. But overall, the fact that it is a pretty good mobile text input device, if you're looking for something really portable, I think it's an interesting option to have. So overall, I think it's a winner for people who are willing to spend the money that it costs on this particular model, which again is $760 as of the time that I'm shooting this video, which puts it more into sort of iPad Pro or mid-range laptop price territory, as opposed to the entry-level territory that you might expect from netbooks of yesteryear. but it is more powerful than most older school netbooks. And so I think it's a really pretty interesting device that I've enjoyed using, that I'm glad that that OneMix sent me so I could compare with the GPT P2 Max and other mini laptops. So this is Brad Linder with Liliputing, taking a look at the OneMix 3 Yoga. You can find more links to more information in the description of this video, as well as links to purchase this device and the optional pen, or even upgraded models that might have faster processors, more memory, more storage. This is Brad Linder with Liliputing.